Welcome, everybody, to the webinar, The Compliance Puzzle, Achieving Speed and Regulation Balance in Software Delivery. My name is Mark Levy. I'll be hosting today's webinar, and I focus on product marketing here at OpsMX. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. The session is going to be about 45, 50 minutes long. We're recording the session. We will send the recording slides to everybody. If you have any questions, please ask in the chat, and we'll answer as many questions as we can. Okay, what I'd like to do now is first introduce Bob Boulay, our presenter today. Bob is VP of Product here at OpsMX. He spent over 20 years in software engineering and product management, focusing on both software and security and compliance. So he's definitely uniquely qualified for today's presentation and discussion. Good morning, Bob. How are you?
I am hanging in there, my friend. How about yourself?
All right, super. Looking forward to it. Bring it on.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thanks for that very kind introduction, Mark. So guys, just a quick roadmap of, sort of what I want to bring us through today. I think, starting off with the nature of software delivery compliance, right? So what are we talking about? Sort of how are we measuring that? Sort of why do we care type of scenarios. Measuring reporting versus enforcement, right? So I think, looking at things like how do we measure success here from a compliance perspective? How do we report on that? And then lastly, sort of how do we enforce it? The old saying is compliance must be complied with, right? So how do we go about getting to an enforcement place? And by the way, all of this stuff is set against the backdrop of doing this at scale, right? So think hundreds of applications, think thousands of pipelines, right? Think multiple dev teams, potentially multiple tool sets. Again, this gets very difficult very quickly. Why a simple software bill of materials is not enough. I think, you've heard us, any of you that have been following some of my sessions in the past, I think software bill of materials is a critical part of this, right? Because there are some key elements that we're measuring in there to gauge whether or not we're complying. But it's far from comprehensive, right? I think that there's a whole bunch of other things that we're going to talk about today that from a compliance perspective need to be measured, right? We need to be able to measure them. We need to be able to make sure that they're being enforced. So these are sort of this section will get into a little of that. And then the big question here that's sort of within everyone's mind is how do we balance the need to operate at scale and live within the guidelines, right? So this can be, depending on your situation, the way your organization is set up, this can be a very, very difficult thing to achieve because inherently compliance will tend to slow us down, right? If we're not doing it the way it needs to be done. And so this is something we want to take a closer look at. Then I'm going to walk you through how we at OpsMX think we can help you solve this problem, right? And let's make no mistake about it, right? It is a problem, right? If you think about it, and you think about how you want to operate at scale, how you need to operate at scale, but also any of you that have sat in front of a SOC 2 auditor or an ISO 27001 auditor, that those interviews are coming, right? And you have to be able to live what you've told those folks, right? You need to take that SDLC, you need to take those certification guidelines like HITRUST or FedRAMP, and you need to be able to show that you're living those things. And you need to be able to prove that you're enforcing those things. So we'll walk through what a potential solution for you might look like through the lens of sort of what OpsMX has developed. And then I think we'll wrap up with sort of how DevOps and compliance can converge on the problem using some of the tooling from OpsMX. And I think that's another critical part of this, right? Like we need to make sure that, and I always tell this story, the shift left movement in terms of getting all developers to be security folks and making sure that they're following security best practices and making sure they're doing everything that's needed to be done to secure software. I think from a compliance perspective, we need to make sure that everybody is involved in compliance, but also we need to make sure that we've got tooling that helps hold us accountable while we go ahead and actually look to scale. And then we'll leave some room at the end for questions. So the nature of software delivery compliance. I think compliance refers to an organization's ability to follow the rules that have been set out by its engineering leadership, typically in the form of an SDLC, and the rules and regulations set out by external bodies that are associated with certifications. Now, a lot of this stuff too could come from your chief security officer or your chief information security officer. It depends on sort of the makeup of your organization, but at its base, we're really looking at sort of what standards are we going to hold ourselves accountable to as part of our SDLC. And why that's so important, right, is we need to be able to go out and talk to our customers about how we are doing this, right? So customers, want to understand what standards you're holding yourself to, right? And then they move past that. Once you sort of are able to move past that, it gets into, okay, so now what external regulatory bodies are you following guidance from, right? So is that SOC 2? Is that ISO? Is that again high trust or FedRAMP or PCI? And again, I think when we start thinking about that, when we start thinking about compliance, suddenly the aperture of our scope needs to get much wider, right? Like we can no longer just think about this from the perspective of, hey, did all the developers run the black duck scan against their code prior to checking it in, right? Now we've got to start looking at source code management and build management and artifact management, i.e., do I have an attack where, or do I have an open attack surface where someone could manipulate an artifact before I get a chance to deploy it? And then deployment, right? Like, what am I deploying into, right? Has that significantly changed? Does it comply with the rules and regulations? Now, make no mistake, this is really about running those checks and understanding what's happening. Obviously, if you go far enough to the right, there are tools that we'll call the playing defense tools, the perimeter security and all those things. But I think at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the deployment architecture is fit to consume new software, right? So then looking at all these things and looking at the checks we need to run, and then ultimately looking to be able to report on or prove the efficacy of a release at each one of these stages by collecting data from your ecosystem and using that data to formulate a attestation, right? That says, hey, this was the status of all of these stages, and then the tools that are inside of those stages at the time of release. Now, if you take that, multiply it by 10, multiply it by 100, multiply it by 1,000, this gets very tricky very quickly, right? It's not that it can't be done. It's just you start to add that element of scale and velocity. Suddenly now it becomes very easy for us to perhaps cut corners, or it becomes very hard for us at the end of the day to say, hey, I've got the auditor coming in next week. Now I've got to go interrogate 10 different systems or 15 different systems to start pulling that information together. So these are the things that I think represent the nature of delivery compliance and why it's such a complex puzzle. Now, again, I mentioned earlier, when we start thinking about this and sort of the way we go about thinking about this, there's sort of measuring and reporting versus enforcement, right? So, of course, we need to be able to measure and report, right? Because not everything is happening in real time, and it's happening very, very quickly. So, of course, we need to have a system of record where if I need to go to an auditor, if I need to go to a customer and say, hey, here's a set of random deployments, and let me prove to you that we were going ahead and actually sort of complying with all the things that we told you we were doing. That's the measurement and reporting, right? So if I were to look at this and say, I need to collect information from all of the tooling in my ecosystem that my developers are using, that my SRE team is using, that my DevOps team is using, and make sure that I'm bringing that information into one place, and then ultimately being able to go ahead and report around that and use that as a measurement of success in terms of compliance, and then being able to generate that efficacy reporting. Again, it's possible without some consolidation, but it's really hard. And then the second side of this coin is enforcement, right? So, if I've got compliance regulations that I need to make sure that I'm measuring and monitoring, the other thing that I need to do is I need to have one very, very independent and opinionated system that's going to blindly enforce rules. Right now, it's going to make sure that those rules, those things that I said were being done, are actually being done. Right. It's going to be able to prevent any non-compliant software from getting into my system. It's going to allow me to codify rules based on a compliance framework. And then, I said blindly, and maybe that was the wrong term, because like anything else, there are always exceptions, right? And auditors understand exceptions, right? But you have to centrally manage those exceptions. You have to be able to document those exceptions. And you also need to be able to time box those exceptions, right? I can't just say, hey, I've, this, between the time that the code was checked in and the time I got ready to deploy, there was a vulnerability that surfaced that is a critical vulnerability. I might say, as a security analyst, hey, I'm going to create an exception here because based on what I know about this today, there is no exploit for this in the way that we're using it. So, but I need some place to be able to document that. And then my SDLC might say, it doesn't matter what the vulnerability is. If it's high or critical, it needs to be remediated within 60 days. So I need to be able to enforce that 60-day rule. And I need to be able to time box that thing. So again, I think that enforcement part of this is also something that we cannot overlook when it comes to compliance. And again, just to take a step back, again, if I'm releasing one pipeline for one application once a year, I can do that on the back of a napkin, not a problem, right? When I get into multiples, that's when this stuff becomes very hard. Now, we talked earlier about the software bill of materials, and this is something that I think has evolved over time. And I actually have one of my previous lives was with a company called Black Duck Software, and they were helping customers manage open source, and we would, sort of generate that software bill of materials. And the same thing happens here with, all the different tools that are out there. They're producing that software bill of materials, so they're looking at your POM files, they're looking at, sort of the dependencies that you're bringing in, and then they're bumping those things up against the various databases that are out there to look for things like vulnerabilities. However, I think that compliance requires us to go beyond just what was the library, what version of the library, and were there any vulnerabilities associated with it. So we want to expand that scope, right? And say, again, our SDLC claims static code, dynamic code analysis, test passing, not just security and vulnerability information, but unit test coverage. That's software bill of materials. We want to look at that. Source code branch validation, approval documentation, and then looking at the makeup of the deployment environment. So there's a whole other list of things here that go into ensuring that I'm delivering compliant code based on either my own internal SDLC or a third party's set of rules and regulations, or in most cases, both, right? And so again, having that ability to go ahead and evaluate those things by bringing in the data from other tools, right? So we don't want to, as OpsMX, we don't want to advocate you having to rip out all your existing tooling. What we want to do is we want to advocate for you dropping something in there that will act as that data consolidation layer, that will go ahead and actually produce this reporting for you, will produce alerting for you when there's compliance issues. And again, the name of the game here has got to be automation, right? You're never going to be able to scale and comply if you don't have a level of automation, if you don't have a filter sitting in between the machinery that's to the left from the developer all the way through the CI process, then monitoring that thing all the way through up into and including the deployment process, and finalizing the evaluation of all of these metrics prior to something being deployed, right? And again, I think if you're automating all of that, not only just the evaluation, but the accumulation of the data, the consolidation of the data, and then ultimately the ability to produce reporting around the data. That is really going to be the utopian environment that's going to allow you to produce software at scale and ensure the level of compliance that your customers are going to hold you to. Now, if we look at, sort of how we balance the need to operate at scale and live within the guidelines, you heard me say this previously, right? It's automation, automation, automation. Manual processes simply will not scale, right? If I have to run around and gather up all this information, I'm going to have some really inefficient. First off, if I do that way, I'm going to absorb a ton of risk, right? If I don't have automation in place to evaluate these rules, I'm going to be looking at human error. Then I'm going to be looking at inefficiencies in terms of reporting. So those 2 to 3 to 4 weeks before an auditor comes in will be nightmarish for me. And then most companies, they don't allow it to get to that point, right? You need to be reporting on this stuff monthly or quarterly. And again, the inefficiencies that go along with trying to do this manually and at scale. I was talking to somebody the other day who was saying, hey, you guys are onto something, because we were looking at this and their organization had 10 different development teams, all of which got to choose what continuous delivery tool they were going to use along with what security tooling they were going to use. So you can imagine all this data flowing, and each team is a snowflake in terms of their tooling. That becomes a really hard problem to solve while making sure that you're within compliance. So that data collection and automated analysis is critical, because if you don't have that, again, you're right back to, do I deploy and hope that nothing's broken, or nothing from a compliance perspective is out of whack, or do I want to slow down and go through all those checks? The answer is you don't want to do neither of those things. What you really want to do is you want to keep moving quickly, and you want to be able to make sure that you've got assurances that you're operating within those compliance guardrails. The system needs to have compliance baked in, without human dependencies. Asking developers to add a deployment step that checks for compliance. Well, that's a gap right there, because what if they don't, right? There's two reasons there, right? You either a bad actor internally, or they just forgot, right? They didn't realize that they were supposed to do that. They're new. They just didn't do it. So again, I think having something that is not a developer's responsibility, we've saddled them with enough around security and deployment security and making sure that prior to code check-ins, all these checks are done. Now the other piece of this too, by the way, is there is a gap between the time that code is checked in and those checks get run and when something's deployed. And in dynamic landscapes like vulnerabilities, things change, right? And so we need to make sure that we've got a final check at the end. And then violations need to be managed centrally, and exceptions need to be time boxed and documented. We'll talk a little bit more about that during the demo portion. But again, I think we need to have some system that, and again, I think the other thing that we recognize, and I want to say this before we go, to take a look at sort of what we've developed, is our expectation is not somebody sitting there staring at a dashboard all day, right? Our expectation is once this is set up and running, the product will bring you back to it when it needs you, right? So that concept of automating the analysis and being able to say, hey, I found a something that is risky, and let me bring a stakeholder back to the tool to make a decision. But if I'm passing all my checks, everything is working out the way it's supposed to, things just keep moving forward, what I'm left with is a nice, easy way to prove that I've done all this stuff. But in the event that something's gone off the rails, I've got there's guardrails in place to sort of bring me back to the tool and say, what do I want to do here? Do I want to fix this problem? Do I want to create an exception? What are the implications between slowing this release down versus letting it go out with this compliance problem? So again, I think it gives you the opportunity to sort of make those decisions. And that is, I think, the key to operating at scale here. Now, what I want to do next is sort of bring you on a short little guided tour of sort of what we've done to, sort of help you achieve this, right? Ultimately, if you agree with us that this is a problem, right? We want to talk to you a little bit about how we might be able to help you solve that problem, right? So just to set the stage, I think, when you think about our tooling, we drop in the midst of your ecosystem. We don't, the idea behind this is that we don't need you to change anything, right? Whatever process your developers are currently following, they can continue to follow. Whatever tooling that you're using within that environment, you can continue to use. What we're going to do is we're going to work with you to set up some of the integrations that we have for some of those tools. We'll be able to start to bring that information in and then start to formulate an assessment of the risks associated with those pipelines and those software deliveries. Now, again, we're out collecting this information behind the scenes and it's completely automated, right? So as an example, this is the application risk dashboard. This gives me the information at an application level. If I drill in, this now gives me the service level information, right? Now, the key here, when we start talking about compliance, is there's the convergence of all that data coming into our system. Then there's a set of rules that you're going to create, right? This is the enforcement part, where you're going to evaluate that data and really sort of make sure that as you're evaluating that data, those rules are being complied with. But on top of all that, we're going down, and what we're doing is we're creating, based on that data, what we call the delivery bill of materials. Now here, this is an accounting of all of the things that software has gone through, all the checks, tests, evaluations that the software has gone through as part of that process of it going through the delivery cycle, right? And here, like as an example, we're connected to SonarQube here. So we know what the source code analysis test looked like. We can prove that this actually happened. The branch protection policies are being enforced. The secret scan, some of the gas features from GitHub, as an example, these things are also being looked at and being tested for. So again, I think when we look at this and we say, okay, we can go through each step of the process here and know that these things that were laid out on our SDLC, or those things that are part of any sort of other sort of compliance framework that you want to work through, I've now got the data consolidated in one place, and I can see that this information is actually correct, right? It's actually gone through this and is being evaluated, and ultimately is absolutely the basis for making a decision to allow this deployment to go through. Things like vulnerability assessments, or again, looking at the deploy stages here, right? I'm looking at things like deployment verification if you're doing either a controlled rollout or a canary deployment. Things like image provenance checks, right? So I want to go back and make sure that at the deployment phase, I'm doing a check to make sure that the image that was created by my build process, that checksum actually matches the checksum of the image that I'm pulling out of my repository, right? So I know no one has hacked into my repo and added a layer to my image with some malicious software in it, because those checksums wouldn't match, or the digital signatures wouldn't match. So again, I think, and then, things like, let's make sure that we do a check for deployment window validation, right? So again, if depending on the business that you're in, you might have certain windows in terms of deployment. So we can check all that stuff to make sure that there aren't any issues. And again, we culminate all that in what we call the secure software delivery attestation, right? So we can then allow you to produce a report, and we can produce these reports in either a machine readable or human readable format. But again, attesting to all of the things that happened, to that delivery. And because this is all automated, these things could be running 100, 1,000, 10,000 runs an hour or at a time. And we're going to be able to capture all this information, and it will be at your fingertips if and when you need it. By the way, that piece of the enforcement part of this is also equally as important. So here, we're allowing you to sort of lay out the rules, as we talked about earlier, and codify those rules and say, these are the things that need to happen, right? And again, I think, we can categorize, we can assign an action to those rules. And then, we can create both global and then application specific rules. But again, I think the idea behind this is that, again, we're checking for that level of compliance. We're not just documenting, but we're enforcing as well. And in the event that something is not compliant, again, our modus operandi here is we don't expect you to be sitting here looking at this thing. We will go ahead and actually tug you on the shirt sleeve and say, hey, there's an issue. We looked at something, we found a problem. As a stakeholder, you're brought back to this and you're able to go ahead and actually decide, hey, I've looked at this. We don't need to upgrade this now because it's not exploitable in our environment, so I'm going to provide an exception. Or it might be, hey, this is a problem. And so I need to go and create it. We've got integrations with Jira, ServiceNow, other scenarios where we might need to initiate some change management or send this whole thing back to development, create a Jira ticket and say, this needs to be remediated. We can't create exceptions here. So again, you get the ability to do that. And then those exceptions are documented and time boxed, right? So now I'm forced to go ahead and document why I'm approving this exception, and then I'm giving it a time box. Now, the other thing that we're working on for a future release is an approval workflow around these exceptions as well. So again, in the context of compliance, again, creating exceptions is not a four-letter word. It just needs to be documented and it needs to be approved. And we all need to understand why there's an exception being provided. So again, being able to document those things and bring that back to an auditor and say, this is what we did, this is why we did it, right? And then again, having that ability to have a scenario where you've got sort of that gatekeeper at the very end, right? To say, let me look at all the data that's been collected. Let me make sure that this is suitable from a compliance perspective to go out. If not, I'll trigger alerts, right? Or, one of the things that I might do here is I might have had a previously blocked pipeline because of an issue. I now am fairly certain that I've solved the problem. So let me go ahead and actually simulate the pipeline run again, just to see. And what we'll do is we'll synthesize all of the net new data that we're collecting around this, and then ultimately display it in the delivery bill of materials here to allow you to go ahead and make a decision in terms of how you want to proceed. So again, if you think about these things, the checks, the guardians, the compliance reporting, that has to all be automated. The only thing that needs to be left to human consumption is really exceptions and managing them here, right? And so that's really where we get the best of both worlds when it comes to both compliance and velocity and scale, is because we don't have to manually evaluate these things. So with that said, let me go back to our slide deck here real quick. Oh, there we go. So then, I think the last piece that I have here, guys, to talk you through is, how do we bring together DevOps compliance teams with one tool, right? And I think that's, one of the things that we talk about often here at OpsMX is, sort of how do we use this tooling to unify these teams, right? To make sure that everyone is sort of on the same page in terms of what's happening, understanding whether or not something complies. It shouldn't be an Easter egg hunt, right? For lack of a better term. We need these teams, these DevOps teams, these compliance teams, the engineering teams, right? These folks need to be on the same page. We don't need to create more work for them, right? I don't want to make it more difficult for developers. We've already given them enough, right? It is now about, are we complying as an organization? And how do we get the eyeballs from our DevOps people? And how do we get the information out to our compliance teams? How do we, again, get that auditor the data that they need so they can very quickly look and say, hey, you've documented your SDLC and you are actually living that life, along with getting all of those deployments out, especially if you're, say, a SaaS operator, right? One of the things that in my career I've faced as a SaaS operator is, how do I, make sure that I can get to a continuous delivery state without having to, it's the seesaw. There's speed of delivery and getting new features to customers faster to add more value, right? And then the other side of the seesaw is the risk that I'm taking on and the compliance violations that I could be taking on, because there isn't a lot of time to sort of get to a place where I can check all of these things. And again, it's great, and I'm a continued advocate of the shift left movement around security, but we all know two things. One, the security landscape is dynamic, right? And so unless you're deploying, and some folks are, seconds after the code is checked in, then you're going to have a gap there, and that gap represents the risk that you have, right? Then the other part of this is, how do I prove that all this work's been done, again, without running around my entire ecosystem, right? And trying to figure out, all right, this team's using this tool. How do I go figure out how to get that data from that tool? We've done that for you, right? And so this is really where it's really critical. And I think, looking at these things and saying, bringing these two operations together and saying, hey, compliance is everyone's job. Or again, I know it's corny and you've all heard it before, compliance must be complied with, right? So that idea of reporting and enforcement, in sort of a single circuit breaker, I think is really our pitch to you today. And I think it also represents something that, as you're looking forward and as your organization is growing, this will become a problem. And we'd love an opportunity to be able to help you solve that problem. So let me stop there and ask if there are any questions or concerns based on sort of what we've seen today.
Yeah, hey Bob, thank you so much. And please, people, enter your questions in. We're here for you. If you're having a compliance problem, check in. Tell us what you're doing. And while we're waiting for the questions, Bob, if you can go to the next slide
Yes, of
as
course.
well. And we want, is anyone going to Google next week? We're going to be there. If you are, say so in the comments. Come by and meet us. You can book a meeting with us. Book our executive team is going to be there. Our CTO is going to be there. You want to talk to our CTO, our CEO. Book a meeting with us. We'll be more than happy. We're going to be there. We're partners. We're going to have an important announcement next week on that as well. So please, any questions, enter them in. We're here for you, compliance and balance. And Bob, while we're waiting, I've been thinking this whole idea, especially the whole DevOps spirit and culture. If you really look at it, if you think compliance is slowing you down, then you're really doing it wrong, right? Because in a DevOps world, speed and compliance aren't enemies. We're about removing friction, right? And by
Yep.
leveraging automation and best practices, we got to make sure that we're fast and compliant. So, we should wear it as like a badge of honor, not a shackle. What do you think?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that the organizations that I know I've consulted with that are having this problem, or have let the compliance aspect slow them down, they'll be the first one to tell you, right? Compliance is the immovable object, right? Nobody survives being on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, right? And so, and that's really what compliance is about. It's those guardrails. It's also about managing those customer perceptions, right? Like, hey, we take this stuff seriously, because in a lot of cases, especially in the SaaS world, or even, just in the world of, hey, I'm shipping software to a company that is the steward of a lot of sensitive information, they count on their vendors to take this stuff seriously. And I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that, by, sort of consolidating and centralizing the evaluation that's used in compliance and then the reporting, there's a way to have your cake and eat it too. And I think we all need to live that. I think you're spot on.
Yeah, just like, when continuous delivery practice first sort of started and Jez Humboldt's book came out, and he talked about this idea of making a deployment a non-event, right? It's just got
Yep.
to be like turning a light switch on. Same thing with compliance and audit. It's just you got to get to a point where it's just a non-event, you can follow the same sort of continuous delivery principles, automation, right? Edward Deming said quality is everybody's responsibility, right? Just like
Hmm.
deploying software. Who's like Vogel, the CTO of Amazon, said, if you build it, you deploy it, right? So
Hmm.
it's the
Yep.
same philosophy, but with compliance. Now you need automation, you need tools, you need to integrate it with. So, so super
Absolutely.
important.
Yep. Yeah, the crush of data, right, will swallow you up, right, if you're not careful, right? And I think, our position here at OpsMX is there needs to be automation in all things evaluation, right? So if I'm going to evaluate data and make a decision, I have to automate that process and then just manage exceptions, right? If you're trying to manage all this end to end, you so think about compliance and compliance enforcement and speed and scale of delivery on a seesaw, right? If you don't automate the evaluation of all of that data, the seesaw quickly tips away from the ability to scale, right? And again, we look at a lot of our customers will look at compliance as the immovable object. They can't afford to absorb a lot of compliance risk, right? It's just, and the ones that do, that survive those things are the ones that actually don't get caught in an audit a year later. They're the ones that identify it early on and are able to remediate, right? So I think that's really the spirit of this whole thing. And I think if we can do that while not adding any additional cognitive load to our developers or our engineering colleagues, and allow DevOps and DevSecOps and compliance to work together and have a single rallying point to work through, I think that is just making the world a better place for software delivery.
Yeah, great. Well, I think you summed it up just perfect. So, look, if no other questions are here, please, people, even if you have questions afterward, book a meeting with us. We're here for you. And hopefully we'll see you next week at Google Next. So, Bob, everybody, thank you so much for your time, and everybody have a great day.
Take care, all, and thanks for coming. Thanks, Mark.